Bill Maher once said on his TV show that it is bad to have faith in anything. If you take Christianity on faith, he said, then that will lead you into becoming the kind of person who takes other things on faith too, like crazy conspiracy theories such as QAnon. The problem with Maher's argument is that he fails to notice that we all take our ideas about morality on faith. You can't prove logically that anyone's ideas about morality are better than anyone else's. In the end, all you can say is something like, this is the set of ideas about morality that I like, and I'm going to believe them. Maher was talking about this once on his show with a Christian journalist named Ross Douthat. Douthat is spelled D as in Denmark, O-U-T-H-A-T, if you want to look him up in Wikipedia. When Douthat pointed out that one cannot logically prove that anyone deserves human rights, Maher said human rights are just common sense. Well, Mr. Maher, that is totally wrong. Look at China. In China, members of the Communist Party are required to be atheists. The Chinese government has been persecuting religious people for more than 70 years now. And the atheists who rule China couldn't care less about human rights. They imprison or kill anybody who dares to criticize them or who dares to say that China should have free elections. So how would you prove to them, Mr. Maher, that they are wrong? They think they are being perfectly logical. They think the logical thing to do in life is grab as much power and money as you can get and treat the common people like dogs. In Russia, Vladimir Putin is the same way. It is obvious that he is an atheist because he was a member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union back when Communist Party members were required to be atheists. In fact, he was a secret police agent. And how does this atheist rule Russia? He and his cronies steal everything that isn't nailed down and kill anybody who dares to complain. Putin thinks it is perfectly logical to ignore human rights. He just wants to have power and money. And of course, North Korea is also ruled by atheists, and the whole country is just one big concentration camp. Just look at the fact that the four biggest mass murderers of the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, were all atheists. Do you really think that is just a coincidence, Mr. Maher? Even the militant atheists admit that Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot were atheists. And as for Hitler, well, I know that the militant atheist liars, such as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, have claimed that Hitler was a Christian, but the evidence they present to support that claim is utterly ridiculous. Look at what the actual experts say. A history professor named Saul Friedlander is considered one of the world's leading experts on the Holocaust. He won a Pulitzer Prize years ago for a massive book he wrote about the Holocaust called The Years of Extermination, Nazi Germany and the Jews, 1939 to 1945. Friedlander is spelled F as in Florida, R-I-E-D-L-A-N-D-E-R, if you want to look up that book in your local library. On page 55 and on page 203 of that book, Friedlander says Hitler and the other top Nazis detested Christianity. They openly said so. You can also look up a massive 2-volume biography of Hitler that was written a few years ago by a prominent history professor named Ian Kershaw. Kershaw is spelled K-E-R-S-H-A-W if you want to look up his books in your local library. Kershaw describes Hitler's life in great detail, and there is simply no evidence that Hitler was religious in adulthood. He did not go to church, he did not go to confession, nobody ever saw him read the Bible or pray, he did not say grace before meals, and he repeatedly jumped into bed with Eva Braun without marrying her first. There is not a speck of evidence that would make anyone think he was religious. Mr. Maher should admit that the four greatest mass murderers of the 20th century, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, were all atheists. Do you really think that is just a coincidence? Mr. Maher, you sit there and say Christianity is a threat to civilization, but atheism is not. Why don't you admit that atheism gives some people the feeling that it is okay to act on their worst impulses? And look at the fact that some Harvard researchers conducted a massive study of young black men years ago and found that those who went to church every week had a much lower crime rate than the ones who did not go to church. You can read about this in an article by Richard B. Freeman on the July 20th, 1986 New York Times. Doesn't that tell you something, Mr. Maher? And look at the fact that Charles Darwin, who was an atheist, wanted to exterminate the blacks. In a letter to a friend, he said that some people belong to higher races and some people belong to lower races, and when higher races exterminate lower races, that is, quote, the progress of civilization, unquote. He thought it was a good thing. You can read about this on pages 206 and 207 of Ronald W. Clark's book, The Survival of Charles Darwin, a biography of a man and an idea. If human rights are just common sense, Mr. Maher, why did a highly intelligent atheist like Charles Darwin think it would be good to exterminate the blacks? And look at H.G. Wells, the famous science fiction writer. Richard Dawkins talks about Wells in his book, The God Delusion. Just go to the index of that book and look up H.G. Wells, and you will see the page number where Dawkins talks about him. And you will see that Dawkins admits that Wells wanted to exterminate the Jews, the blacks, and the Asians, so the white race could rule the world. For proof that Wells was an atheist, just look at the biography of him that was written by Norman and Jean Mackenzie. Wells was very open about being an atheist. He never tried to hide it. Look at page 102 of the book The End of Faith by the militant atheist Sam Harris. Harris admits that some German writers in the 1800s wanted to exterminate the Jews, but he never claims that those writers were Christians, because they weren't Christians. They were a bunch of atheists who believed the Jews had evolved to be parasites and that therefore we should get rid of them. In fact, Harris has admitted that Christians care a lot more about morality than atheists do. He talks about this on pages 5 through 46 of his book, The Moral Landscape, and he talks about it again on page 198 of that same book. He says that when he was traveling around the United States on his first book tour, he was shocked and amazed to discover that many atheists, not just a few, were willing to openly tell him that they thought morality was just a meaningless word. They said they never worried about it. They just did whatever they thought would benefit themselves. And look at a book called American Grace, written by the famous sociologist Robert Putnam and his colleague David Campbell. You can read about Putnam in Wikipedia. There is a long article about him because he's such a prominent man in his field. On pages 445 through 465 of their book American Grace, Putnam and Campbell report that they surveyed the American people and found that religious people donated a lot more money to charity than non-religious people, both in dollar terms and as a percentage of income. They even donated more to non-religious charities than the non-religious people did. They also did more volunteer work than the non-religious people did, and were even more likely to donate blood than the non-religious people were. So how do you explain that, Mr. Maher? Why do you think Christians are more generous to the needy than atheists? Isn't it obvious that the atheists, taken as a group, just don't see any logical reason why they should care about anyone except themselves and a few close friends and relatives? Look at Edward O. Wilson. He's a biology professor at Harvard, a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and one of the most famous scientists in the United States today. A few years ago, he wrote a book called Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge, and in that book there is a chapter called Ethics and Religion. And in that chapter, Wilson says, morality is just whatever most people say it is. If most people on earth want to exterminate the Jews or the gays, or if most people think a man should have the right to kill his wife for cheating on him, then, according to Wilson, that's morality. He also thinks people should have the right to change the rules of morality whenever they feel like it. He believes there are no eternal moral truths. I think if atheism becomes more and more common, then more and more people will think like Wilson. They will think morality is just whatever people think it is. And look at an article about a billionaire atheist named Sam Altman that was published in the October 10, 2016 issue of New Yorker magazine. Altman openly admits that he would be willing to kill 100,000 total strangers to save the lives of his closest friends. He has given a lot of thought to it, he says, and that is the conclusion he reached. I think as atheism becomes more common, more and more people will admit that they think just like Altman. They don't care about anyone except themselves and a few close friends and relatives.